Hi, this is Danny Doyle, and happy Valentine's Day if you celebrate it. We're encouraged to focus on our romantic loves on this day, but I'll be honest, it's mostly just a scam to sell greeting cards and chocolate. You don't need a special day to tell someone you love them, and romantic love isn't more or less valuable than other forms of love. That being said, it does make a great excuse to have a holiday special video about romance in Fire Emblem and how it's evolved over the ages, because it has gone on a bit of an evolution, especially in modern times, but it's always kind of been in the background of Fire Emblem at the very least. Even back so far as Fire Emblem 1, where most of the characters didn't have anything beyond a single line of dialogue, and many didn't even get that. Like, a lot of the death quotes were just so-and-so died, oh no. But as the main character, Marth was given a love interest, the Princess Sheeta. And in fact, her status as his love interest results in her having a special death dialogue, where the narrator says, "I'm so sorry, Marth, Princess Sheeta died." And this romance is a through line of Marth's character carried over not only into the sequel, where he gets married to Sheeta, but also the remake, where the good ending, bad ending hinges on whether or not Sheeta is alive. Of course, Marth's first outing has a fairly generic narrative, so it shouldn't come as any surprise that the main character ends up getting together with the first female character in the party. But the prince is not the only one to get hitched on this journey. The strongest man in Archena, Astrum, is recruited into your army by Medea, although since he starts as a red unit, it is possible for him to one-round her, which I need to do my due diligence and say is not a Mathis moment, because Mathis will not one-round Lena. Hashtag justice for Mathis. Speaking of Lena, in Chapter 3, A Brush in the Teeth, still the best chapter title in all of Fire Emblem, Julian betrays a gang of thieves in order to free Lena because he is in love with her. And she ends up falling for him as a result of this as well, offering to sacrifice herself by warping him out, and eventually ending up getting married to him despite the protests that her brother Mathis has in their recruitment conversation. In the sequel, Julian and Lena are together, and this is actually what causes Julian to rejoin Marth's group, because Lena goes missing and he wants to look for her. As it turns out, she has been kidnapped and brainwashed as part of a ritual to revive Medius, and the only way that you can re-recruit her and break the brainwashing is with true love by having Julian talk to her. There are actually 4 clerics who are kidnapped, and they all need to be talked to by a specific person, since each of them is close to someone in your party. Maria can be talked to by her sister Minerva, but both Ellis and Naya need to be talked to by people that they are in romantic love with. Ellis needs to be talked to by Merrick, who ends up paired with her at the end of the story, and Nyanya needs to be talked to by Sirius, who is actually Camus in disguise. Camus and Nanya were in love with each other in FE1, but theirs was a tragic romance as they ended up on opposite sides of the war, and Camus was thought to be dead. This resulted in Nanya marrying Hardin, although she did not love him, and this is what drove Hardin insane and allowed him to be corrupted and turned into the evil emperor. Sirius returning to Archena and rescuing Nanya from the cultists who Hardin sold her out to seems like it would be the happy ending of a romance story involving a love triangle with an evil brainwashed emperor. But unfortunately, this isn't the happy ending you might think it is, because Sirius leaves Archena altogether after the events of FE3 and does not get back together with Nanya. Instead, he goes to his true love in Valentia. You see, in between FE1 and FE3, Camus ended up in Valentia under the name Zeke with no memory of his previous identity, and was nursed back to health by Tatiana, who he fell in love with. After the events of SOV, he returned to Archena in order to save Nanya's life, but he did not stay there long, as he ultimately returned to Valentia to live out the rest of his days with Tatiana. But speaking of Valentia, because Gaiden had a much smaller cast, it and the remake SOV were able to flesh out the relationships between these people to a much greater extent. And this resulted in a lot more romantic pairings. There is a large sub-narrative about the romance between the two main lords, Alm and Celica, who are driven by different ideals but eventually end up working together and end up getting married. But many of the minor characters also end up getting paired off. Alm's two paladins, Clive and Bentilda, are paired off with each other before the story even begins. Gray, Tobin, and Claire have a bit of a love triangle, with Gray and Claire ultimately ending up together. Bowie and May bicker like school children, but end up getting married at the end of the story. And Leon is in love with Valbar, although this love does not ever come to fruition, which is also true of the SOV-OC, Faye, who is in love with Alm, but unfortunately Alm doesn't like gacha games. These canonical pairings also allow for a variety of ending cards based on which characters live and die, with many characters having their fates drastically altered based on if the person they love falls in battle. For example, if Claire dies, then Gray ends up being a vagabond mercenary fighting until he dies. Meanwhile, if Tobin dies, then Gray is lost to alcoholism, although in the remake, Claire is able to coax him out of this demon due to his love for her. One notable weird paired ending is that if Clive is alive, Matilda actually retires from knighthood in order to better serve him as a wife because, SOV just had to take Gaiden and make it more misogynist. But the pairings in the Valentia games were likely popular because they returned to this idea in FE3. I already mentioned the kidnapped maidens, but those are not the only characters who end up paired in the story of Book 2. The hero Samson returns from FE1, but instead of having a rivalry with Aaron, he has a romance with Sheena. But perhaps more notably, there is a very weird love triangle between Abel of the Christmas Cavaliers and Est and Pala of the White Wings, which ends up with Abel and Est together. And in fact, because of Abel's love for Est, when Est is taken hostage, Abel is forced to fight against Marth's army, only being convinced to stand down once you free Est from prison. Although if you're a pro gamer, you kill him with Cain to assert Red Cap supremacy. Of course, in this point in Fire Emblem story, the romance was mostly confined to the story, with it only affecting mechanics insofar as recruiting red units or the minor support bonuses that some of the romantic pairs got with each other. All of that changed once we left Archena for the shores of Judgral, because here, romance became a core mechanical system that impacted the gameplay greatly. Fire Emblem 4 is divided into two generations. Prologue through Chapter 5 is the first generation following Sigurd's quest to fumble the ball repeatedly, and from Chapter 6 onward, Seliph spends his time cleaning up his father's mess. The majority of the characters in the second generation are children of the first gen units. 4 of these children are fixed, as Deirdre and Sigurd will always end up together, resulting in Seliph and then eventually Julia through Deirdre and Arvis. Meanwhile, Sigurd's sister, Ethlyn, is already married to Quan at the start of the game, resulting in their 2 children, Altena and Leaf. However, everyone else is variable. Each mother gives birth to a pair of children, but only if they build enough lover points with one of the males in your army, and whichever male it is will be the father of their children, resulting in different stats, skills, and golden item inheritance. Each mother has a few people who the game tries to push as her possible canonical husbands. For example, Aideen has special events if she marries any of Midir, Jamka, Azel, or Claude, and Ira has special events that result in her getting more lover points with Holin and Lex. But it is very possible to marry people who do not have any events with each other with proper planning and positioning. For example, a popular pairing from a mechanical perspective is Lu and Tiltu, despite the fact that the two do not have any canon reason for being together. For anyone who hasn't played FE4, the way its lover system works is kind of like a rudimentary support system. For the first 50 turns of any map, every character will gain support points with other potential lovers at varying rates depending on how fast their lover growth is. Additionally, ending turn next to another character of the opposite gender will result in a bonus, and there is a glitched jealousy system that can result in you getting even more points by stealing them from other lover pairs. Additionally, as I mentioned, there are some events that result in specific pairs gaining love points with each other. If any of the Generation 1 women are unmarried or killed at the end of Chapter 5, then instead of their children joining Selip's army, you will get a pair of replacement units, who are mostly worse than the child units you could have made yourself. For example, if Ira does not end up getting married, instead of having Larsai and Ulster, you will get the replacement units Rodoban and Seridne. In comparison to Larsai and Ulster, they have worse stats, do not have any skills, and promote into the hero class instead of the swordmaster class, which in FE4 is a strict downgrade. The second generation is also able to get married, but because there is no third gen, there is much less motivation to pair specific units for a mechanical reason. A few pairings do have unique events that help build their lover points, and there are some that give stat boosts upon getting married, but other than that, there's not much benefit to it other than pairing people because you like them as a couple. In this way, Gen 2 allows for a lot more freedom in shipping without punishing you too heavily. If you wanted to ship characters in Gen 1 and ended up making kids that are significantly weaker, you can kind of feel punished for rooting for your specific pairings. But that isn't the case in Generation 2, which is kind of cool. This game's sequel slash midquel slash interquel, I don't know what you would call Thracia, because it takes place in between the generations of Fire Emblem 4. But it doesn't have the pairing system that FE4 has. Instead, going back to the Archena style of certain characters being paired together within the story and occasionally boosting themselves with supports as a result of that. The most prominent of these is Leaf and Nana. They both exist in FE4 and can get married in that game, but in FE5 they are always lovers. Series creator Shozu Kaga has said he doesn't consider FE5 to be the definitive canon on pairings, but instead just one possible way that FE4 could play out, so it is worth noting that this doesn't invalidate other pairings from FE4 if you ship Leaf and someone else, like, that's still completely valid. And the same should be applied to Generation 1, because in FE5, Erin's child, Ced, is the son of Luin, meaning that of course these two ended up together. The same could be said for Ratchasis and Finn, but also Ratchasis and Beowulf. It's a little bit unclear. There's some implications that Ratchasis had at least one child with Beowulf because Dermot can use the Beo sword, but Fergus can also use the Beo sword, and he is supposedly Beowulf's child from outside of wedlock with Ratchasis. But then also Finn says that he is Nana's father, and it's not clear as to whether that's adoptive father or birth father. So maybe he was married to Ratchasis, but then Ratchasis cheated on him with Beowulf, and Beowulf had Fergus with someone else. It's all beginning to kind of sound like a soap opera. So bringing things to a little bit more stable grounds, we do have a couple of married couples in FE5. Brighton and Machua, who rescue Leaf in Chapter 4, are married to each other, as are Glade and Selfina. Orson and Tanya have some sort of crush on each other, although it doesn't end up coming to fruition, which is also true of Miranda's crush on Leaf, as his heart is stolen by another. Lastly, from the limited characterization we get, Fergus seems to have romantic feelings for Karen, although it could just be that he's flirtatious, taking after his father Beowulf. It can be hard to tell the full extent of character relationships in these early games where we got such limited dialogue. But all of that changed in FE6 with the introduction of supports, fleshing out the secondary and tertiary cast, and giving much more concrete information on who is in love with whom. The support system in Fire Emblem 6 was an evolution from the lover system in FE4, but it was still fairly rudimentary compared to what we might expect from modern support systems. And as a result of that, the only character who got paired endings based on his support ranks was Roy, and if he had an A support with any of his female supports, he would get married to them. Meaning that Lilina, Laurum, Sophia, Shanna, Sue, and Cecilia could all potentially marry the young lion. And yes, you heard me right, Roy does have the option to marry Cecilia, who is his teacher. Fucking gross stuff. But Roy is not the only character who is in love with people in Fire Emblem, because as we dive into the supports of FE6, we can see that there are a few canon pairings. Zealot and Juno are married before the events of FE6, and they stay together throughout the game. Meanwhile, Astolfo and Aigrin were also together, although Astolfo ended up leaving Aigrin before the events of Binding Blade because he was worried that he was putting her in danger due to his work as a spy for Hector. When Aigrin and Astolfo meet up again due to both joining Roy's army, Aigrin recognizes him and tries to get him to open back up to her, but Astolfo refuses. Aigrin eventually understands, expressing that she knows that spies carry information and he would need to be tortured and potentially put her in danger if he were ever captured. But even then, Astolfo is unable to acknowledge that he was the man she was married to, and instead tells her that she must have been dreaming, and that that man died a long time ago in the sands of the desert. It's actually quite tragic, and given that Astolfo is portrayed as heavily alcoholic in his other supports, I think it's fair for us to assume that he is not happy with the way that things turned out in his life. Especially after Hector dies. It feels like he gave up his happiness for nothing. In fact, in the ending of FE6, he helps to rebuild Ostia and then just disappears. Nobody knows what happened to him after that. The same happens with Aigrin after she returns to Nabata, so it's possible the two of them found somewhere they could be happy outside of the eyes of the rest of the world, and that's a nice thought, I guess. But personally, I think it's far more likely that the story for both of them ended in tragedy. There was just far too much harm already done. Especially when you factor in that the two of them had a daughter who also died young shortly after Astolfo's disappearance. Beyond that, there's not much romance in Fire Emblem 6, although the support system was expanded significantly in FE7, which allowed for many of the secondary and tertiary characters to get together if you shipped them. However, because FE7 was a prequel to FE6, for the most part these pairings cannot be canonized. And so while, for example, Hector could end up married to Lyn, Florina, or Farina, nothing elevates one of these pairings above the others in terms of canonicity. The majority of the paired endings available are explicitly romantic, although some characters are a little bit less fortunate. For example, Isadora has two possible paired endings that result in her heartbroken tragedy, one with Legault and one with Renault. I guess she shouldn't date people with alt at the end of their name. The only happy ending she has is reconciling with her ex-husband, Harkin. But on the topic of reconciling lovers, one of the most interesting romances is stretched across FE6 and FE7. In FE6, the characters Karel, Bartre, and Fear make up a generational family. Bartre is Fear's father, and Karel is her grandfather. However, Karel's daughter, Carla, is dead at the time, due to some sort of tragedy that Bartre was unable to prevent, which resulted in the family shattering from each other, which is why they all join at separate points throughout the campaign. Since a younger version of Bartre is playable in FE7, Carla is also recruitable as a joke character in the Hector mode campaign. If a level 5 warrior Bartre fights her in the arena and neither of them dies, she will join your army, reconciling their love. We actually learn in their paired ending that the tragedy that took her from the family was illness. So that's kind of a neat capstone to that subplot. But perhaps the most interesting thing that FE7 did with romance, and something that no Fire Emblem game has done since then, is give you a character who already has their paired ending, in the form of Pent and Louise, with an A support with each other, already at base. From a gameplay perspective, this allows them to give each other bonuses simply by being deployed near each other. And this is really cool because it gives you characters with a pre-established relationship and pushes that relationship into the gameplay. This sort of thing had happened invisibly in FE3 and FE5, but at least to me, it is a lot cooler when it is in a game where you can build relationships amongst other people to have someone join and just have a pre-established relationship. And it takes it even further because if one of them is killed, they will both leave your army, with the excuse that one of them got injured and they both have to leave in order to tend to that injury. There is a character pair kind of like this in Thracia, because if Lenoan dies, then Dean will leave your army, since he was only sticking around out of loyalty and perhaps love to her, but nothing like this has ever happened again, and I think that's a shame. Especially since with the state of romance in modern Fire Emblem, we're probably not going to ever get anything like it outside of fan games. So once again, ROM hacks to the rescue! And speaking of ROM hacks, most of them are based off of Fire Emblem 8, which is the third game in the GBA trilogy, and it functions much like FE7 in terms of how its romances come from paired endings. But because it's not limited by being a prequel game, it could be a little bit more freeform in who it shipped its characters with, and it used this freedom to give us one canonical pairing, Colm and Naimi. While these characters do have solo endings, the fact that they start with a pre-established relationship and neither of them have paired endings with any other cast members indicates to me that they are as close as we're going to get to a canonical pairing in the Game Boy Advance era. They also automatically build their C support, which makes it much easier to get their pairing if you're using both of them, so that itself is also quite nice. Vanessa and Inez are also fairly close to being a canonical pairing, due to the fact that Vanessa's crush on Inez is the subject of multiple support lines that she has, but Vanessa can also end up marrying Ford, so it's not set in stone. Fire Emblems 9 and 10 are a single continuous story, so it makes sense to talk about them in unison. Compared to FE7 and FE8, there is significantly less romance in the Tellius duology, both in terms of fixed couples and even in terms of player customizability. Path of Radiance got rid of paired endings entirely, and Radiant Dawn has a few paired endings, but far fewer than any other entry in the series, and the majority of them are not romantic. That being said, there are a couple of couples that I want to talk about in this segment, and the first is Khalil and Largo. During the events of Path of Radiance, they are a married couple, and yet they seem to be the series' first example of an explicitly open marriage, as is demonstrated in Khalil's support with Joffrey, where she attempts to romance him. However, because this is Path of Radiance we're talking about, they can't actually do any representation without being a little bit bigoted. So this open marriage is played for laughs, where the joke is, oh, Khalil wants to date someone other than her husband, please point and laugh. In addition, despite the fact that the two of them are married, their relationship is quite unhealthy. When Ike hires Largo to join the Crimean army, Khalil's initial reaction is to complain. She doesn't actually want to spend time with her husband, and it feels like a couple from a 50s sitcom. Albeit with the roles reversed. Instead of the traditional wife bad, it is Khalil complaining about and attempting to escape her husband. During the 3-year time gap between Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn, the two of them seem to have settled down quite a bit. They opened up a shop in the Crimean castle and adopted a baby, Amy. But because Largo never joins the player's army, there isn't much insight into their relationship beyond this. Radiant Dawn does give us insight into a different romantic pairing, that being Astrid and Makalov. They were characters that were not dating in Path of Radiance, but they do have a support chain, and that support chain appears to be the one that was canonically pursued, because Astrid ends up with Makalov, which led to much outrage from the fanbase, as Makalov is a quite disliked character, and not without reason. He is kind of a horrible human being. Due in part to his gambling addiction, he takes advantage of everyone he's close to, including his sister, who is often left holding the bag when debtors come looking for her on account of Makalov's behavior. There's definitely something to be said about the way in which Makalov's gambling addiction is treated by the game as a moral failing, especially since Intelligent Systems makes a lot of their money from a mobile gambling app. But for our purposes, the main thing I want to focus on is his marriage. Because despite fan outcry about how this ruined Astrid's characterization, I actually think the two of them ending up together is kind of fitting for both characters. Like, sure, there's a subtle undercurrent of misogyny in the relationship, but when is that not true in Fire Emblem? However, I do think the through line of a man who takes advantage of everyone ending up with a woman who is far too naive for the world makes some amount of sense, and it's even played into in their Path of Radiance support. It's definitely quite the tragic end for Astrid, especially when you consider that her backstory was leaving Begnion to try to get independence, only to end up under another abusive man's thumb. But personally, I think stories are more satisfying if not everyone gets a happy ending. Although, speaking of tragic endings, a major subplot of Path of Radiance revolves around a doomed romantic couple, that being Enna and her fiancé Rajan. The Dragon Lagoon's Enna ends up working for the nation of Dane in order to try to get closer to Ashnard's mount, because his mount is actually another Dragon Lagoon's who Ashnard has turned feral with experiments. After you defeat the Mad King, Enna is able to reunite with her fiancé once more, and be with him in the last moments of his life. And while this is a sad ending in Path of Radiance, there is a spark of hope in Radiant Dawn, where it is revealed that Enna is pregnant, and this is the first new dragon child in hundreds of years. It doesn't bring her love back, but it is a bit of a happy footnote at the end of a tragic story. But I've waffled on about straight couples for long enough. I know what my audience comes here for, so I'll get to the gay shit. There are no confirmed homosexual couples in Path of Radiance or Radiant Dawn, but there are a couple who are strongly implied to be, including some revolving around the main Lord Ike himself. He is most commonly shipped with Soren, and there's no denying that the two of them love each other in some way, shape, or form. Although whether that love is romantic or not is up to viewer interpretation. You can get a paired ending between them through a convoluted series of events, but perhaps more noteworthy is if Ike gets the paired ending with Ranulf, his only other potential pair, the ending still mentions Soren. It has Ike, Ranulf, and Soren go off on an adventure to distant lands, instead of just Ike and Soren. This has led to the popular fan theory of the three of them being a throuple, but as I say, there is nothing in text that explicitly confirms this. In fact, the only paired endings that are explicitly romantic do not have any other options, implying that these are likely intended to be the canon pairings between the characters. Elincia ends up with Joffrey, Mist ends up with Boyd, Leanne ends up with Naysala, Jill ends up with Har, and Micaiah, the game's other main lord, ends up with Soth. And this pairing in particular is notable because it is kind of a weird reflection of the relationship between Pent and Louise. Because in the beginning of the game, the two of them have an A support, although it's not indicating their status as a romantic couple, but instead simply that they are incredibly close to each other. Funny enough, you can actually remove the support because of the way that Radiant Dawn's support system works. And if you do so, they don't have a romantic ending together anymore. And an extra funny detail about this is Micaiah's solo ending actually changes depending on whether or not Tellius survives, but I bet most players haven't seen it simply because the support with Soth comes pre-packaged, and there's not much incentive to take the support away from them. Overall, despite having an incredibly large cast, Tellius doesn't have that many romantic pairings. And the ones that exist don't get fleshed out very much either. But it is noteworthy in being the end of an era, so to speak, because the next game in the series that wasn't a remake was Fire Emblem Awakening, and with it came a revamped support system with a heavy emphasis on shipping, as well as a self-insert avatar who could romance the characters in the game. And because of that, characters with pre-existing romantic relationships are kind of a thing of the past. In Fire Emblem Awakening, this change was understandable, and actually justified within the story. You see, much like FE4, Awakening is a multi-generational story, but there is not a time skip. Instead, the first generation has children by this matchmaking mechanic, and those children travel back in time from a doomed future, trying to prevent the world from being ended. It's actually quite neat, at least in concept. In execution, I feel like the story kind of fumbles all over the place, but it's a neat idea, and a justified way of working both child units and the pairing system into the Fire Emblem gameplay loop. Because you can match whomever you want with each other, there aren't any fixed canonical pairings. However, the game's code does actually have preferred partners for all of the units, both from Generation 1 and Generation 2, which is something I only learned recently from watching Ellery's videos on the topics. They will be linked in the description, and if you haven't seen them already, you absolutely should, and hit the subscribe button while you're over there. However, while Awakening may have had unofficial canonical pairings, Fates did not carry over this same system. Instead, its supports only build at two speeds, fast and slow. And the main difference between them is with a slow support, it takes 2 chapters to get from C support to B support, but with a fast support, it only takes 1. However, there is another place we could potentially look if we're interested in finding canonical pairings for the FE Fates cast, and that is at support tiebreakers. For those who are not aware, in Fire Emblem Fates, you can only gain maximum support points of 3 with a single character each chapter. You can also gain 2 with another character and 1 with a third character. If you did enough actions in a single map to gain 3 or more points with more than one character, then it looks at how many support points you gained with everyone and gives first place 3, second place 2, and third place 1. Although it gets a little bit more complicated since your support partners can also have different first, second, and third places. I'm oversimplifying, but it's not really important to understand exactly how the points work for this next part. Instead, the important thing to know is that in the event of a tie, each character actually has a list in order of who they prioritize putting in first place. And you don't even have to data mine in order to find out what this list is, because if you have a full support log, then looking in the support log in the records hall will show you in order each character's priority list. That's the order that the supports are listed in. So if you are extremely passionate about a particular ship in Fire Emblem Fates, check out the supports log, and if they are high on the priority pool, you can use that as justification that your ship is actually canonically better than your rival's ship. Other than that, there are 2 notable additions that Fire Emblem Fates added when it comes to romance. The first is that, unlike Awakening, there are some characters with pre-established romantic relationships. Kagero and Saizo are exes, and they can get back together if you have them get the S support, but even if you don't, they talk about the reasoning for their breakup in their C through A support. I think this is kind of neat, and we haven't seen anything like this since Fire Emblem 6. The second addition is that the self-insert character is now able to do gay relationships. They're limited to 1 character on each route, Rajat on Birthright and Niles on Conquest, or you can do either on Revelation, which is why Rev is the best route, by the way. It is worth noting that there is a mechanical disadvantage to making your character gay. You can't have a child, so you don't get Kana, which isn't a big deal, but you also can't farm experience from their map, and if you're male, you don't get access to Nina. Which is a little bit ironic because Nina's whole thing is that she loves yaoi, and yet she can't exist in the only universe where there are two men together. I won't mince words. This is a very disappointing first outing for gay romance in the series. Considering the other babies are justified via a baby microwave dimension, it's not that much of a stretch to say that Kana and Nina were created via magic, or the power of love, or the stork exists in Fateslandia. I'm really not a fan of the way that this was implemented, and neither were most LGBTQ fans of Fire Emblem, which, to their credit, Intelligent Systems took the feedback and added more and better gay options in the sequel, Three Houses. In the jump from 3DS to Switch, Fire Emblem abandoned the S-support pairings and child units. However, it doubled down on the dating simulator aspect associated with the player avatar, adding features like the ability to give your units gifts or take them to tea time. And the spin-off Three Hopes expanded this feature even further by adding different types of dates, like horseback riding. There are actually a large number of paired endings, many of them romantic. But in the base game, you can only determine the paired ending of Byleth, as before the final battle, you will get the option to take any of the units you've reached A support with and S support them to get a paired ending and a special CG. The majority of these endings are romantic, and there's even some same-sex ones, although the game initially faced criticism for the way that it handled these. Female Byleth had 5 same-sex paired endings, although only 3 of these were explicitly romantic, those being Edelgard, Dorothea, and Mercedes. Meanwhile, male Byleth only had 3 same-sex endings, and 2 of them were explicitly non-romantic. The main criticism for this imbalance was that frequently lesbian relationships are seen as more acceptable than gay male ones, oftentimes tying into the fetishization of sapphic relationships by straight men. This imbalance was eventually corrected when the DLC added 2 more romantic gay endings for male Byleth, meaning that you could be gay with Yuri, Yuritsa, or Lindhard, although Yuri was locked behind the paywall, leading to some to criticize it as a pay-for-gay scheme. I've made a video before about how I don't like avatars and the weird forced bisexuality and how that affects queer representation and romance in general in Fire Emblem, so I don't want to rehash all of those points, and instead I'll focus in on a different issue I take with Three Houses' approach to romance, and that being that it explicitly encourages student-teacher relationships. Despite the fact that Byleth is the same age as the majority of the students in Three Houses, the Avatar is placed in a position of authority over the rest of the cast, because they are the professor to all of the recruitable units. Using this position to pursue romantic interests is an explicit abuse of that power, even though the relationships themselves do not become explicitly romantic until a 5-year time skip, at which point Byleth is no longer their professor. However, that level of authority still remains. The relationship began with it after all. It's one of the reasons that in many parts of the world, doctors and therapists are not allowed to date former clients. And this same principle applies to students and teachers. Before I was a YouTuber, I worked as a mental health professional in the school system, and we were actually banned from having romantic relationships with even the family of former students, let alone former students. It was considered a fireable offense. People on the internet tend to throw the word grooming around willy-nilly, applying it to situations where it really does not have relevancy. But I would say that this situation is at the very least analogous to grooming. Byleth begins a relationship with a student, gets involved in their personal life and problems, and then 5 years later ends up getting romantic with them. It feels real icky. Like, I know that shipping is a popular aspect of modern Fire Emblem, and there's people who really enjoy the dating sim portions of this franchise. But with Three Houses in particular, despite how much I love its cast, I find the dating aspect to be gross because of this power dynamic. Three Hopes was a game that I bounced off of pretty hard for a bunch of reasons, but one of the changes that it made that I really appreciated was that player's insert, Shez, just became another student as opposed to the teacher. And I know that Three Houses, they wanted you to be able to engage with the whole tutoring and assigning students to study specific things or do specific drills so you can have them go into the classes that they studied, but that still could have been accomplished by simply making Byleth into the house leader or prefect or something like that. That way they have enough authority to tell people what they're supposed to study, but not so much that it becomes an ethical consideration to have a romantic relationship with a fellow student. And that brings us to the most recent entry in the franchise, Fire Emblem Engage, which did away with paired endings almost entirely. If you do an optional side mission, then the avatar character Alir is still able to get an S support with any member of the cast. Although whether or not these are explicitly romantic varies from character to character, with most of it just being an implication that we're close to each other, whatever that means for the relationship. But unlike in Three Houses, the characters don't end up getting paired with each other if not matched with the avatar. And because the ring is locked behind an optional map, it's not even something that all playthroughs are going to get. Personally, it's my least favorite map in the game, so I skip it on most playthroughs. The support system has some of the trappings from Three Houses. For example, you can still give gifts to the other members of the army, and there's activities you can go for. But in the Fodlan games, the tea time and various date activities had a whole drawn-out minigame to them. There's dialogue choices that you made, and sometimes the character will like those choices, and that'll increase the relationship, and sometimes they won't like that, and it won't increase the relationship. Here, it's all just boiled down to, let's see a cutscene of Chloe and Vander swimming in the pool, and then their support rank goes up. I don't know if those two characters have a support with each other, but I'm not looking it up, because if the devs are going to be lazy when implementing romance into Engage, then I'll be lazy when talking about it. It's a shame because I actually like a lot of the characters, and there is some romantic chemistry between the cast members in some of their supports. But none of them can end up with each other, which just feels really weird. I don't know, this element of Engage just feels kind of rushed, like it was added last minute, maybe because they saw how popular the dating aspect of Three Houses was. I don't have any evidence to back that up, other than the fact it just feels really bare bones. That is the end of our journey through romance in the Fire Emblem franchise. I don't have much to say, there's not really a grand overarching conclusion. I just thought it'd be neat to take a look at things to celebrate Valentine's Day. I hope you have a wonderful day though, stay safe gamers, and it's time to thank my patrons. So, thank you to Eris, Michael Kraus, Len, Gameboot, Kurosa, Fyrant, Smaz Ruby, Zycrom, Robin D, Lizard Bongwater, Christopher Bueno, Marin McLean, Calamity Callie, Theythom, Andu, Reflect, a clever username of lies, YLO1, George Grenville the 7th PM, Jamie Collins, Mean Jojo, Thick Molder, Tailored Muffin, Floahay, Faulty Videos, Lyra, Toaster But Really, Kyle Madison, Derek Williams, Bell Wenska, Diceike, Ginger, Root Beer Pants, Queen Eliza, Aerith Emblem, Adele, Gabe the Green, Control Tejas, Roman Kormancic, Knick-Knack Hammersmack, SUP, Caius Cole, and Some Trades. And a special thank you to my Jagans, Autumn Kelsey, and Lilzabeth. If you're interested in supporting the channel, there is a link to my Patreon below. For as little as $3 a month, you get access to all of my videos a week early, alongside cat pictures, and for higher tiers, the ability to vote on future video topics. Today's comment code word is mutton, so make sure you include mutton in your comment so I know you made it to the end of the video. And with that, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.